Andy, welcome this is your first live conversation on Paper UK, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is.
Oh,
Absolutely, yeah.
well, look at you joining the club. So a lot of people don't know that Andy is actually our chair for Paper UK. So why don't you come on in and introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, and I also am curious to know why you joined Paper UK, what you're planning to
Oh,
do.
straight away. Yeah. Thank you, Calliese. Yeah. I suppose, I mean, the obvious thing is I've known about Favour for years, working across the sector, my own personal experience of recovery. So I'm someone that's, been one of those people that's reached out and had some amazing support from treatment services in England, and then through my own curiosity, really, and the need to build a career. I started to kind of get into college and think about what I could do because I entered that time in my life with no qualifications, and I'm sure people listening to this or people that may listen to this will sound like a very familiar story. Um, but I was very curious about the therapeutic side to the support that I'd had and how it helped me make sense and meaning of what was happening in my life to give me that platform to move forward. So I got kind of belatedly down the line, got involved in the sector, ended up working in the treatment sector now for around 20 years. But during that journey, of course, I'd come across the recovery walks. I'd heard of Anne Marie. I love reading stuff. I love my opinion being challenged. I love to hear from other people. I was kind of adamant on, although I'm not professing perfection to this, because I'm sure I have my own little echo chamber that I want to believe, but I want to hear what people are saying. And Anne Marie was definitely one of those people that I would read around, and it would get me thinking. It would get me thinking. So I reached out to Anne Marie when they were looking for new board members and said, "Look, if I can bring anything to that table to help and support the work that you're doing, and selfishly, to continue my own personal development." So I was warmly accepted, Calliese, onto the board.
Hey, I mean, I think we try to we're pretty friendly around here, do what we can.
Yeah, yeah.
So today we are kind of talking about the cost of disconnection, trauma, trust, and the systems we build. And I think before we even start to dive into this, what drew you to this work? I think it's very interesting we all have a story, we all have our own experiences, we all gravitate to different things. So what drew you to this work and why has it held your focus for over 20 years?
So I think initially, what really struck me was, and this was more of the fellowships that I was involved with, there was this kind of this whole real big notion around, keep what you've got by giving it away. Which I'll be honest, I baffled the hell out of me to start with. I was like, what are we talking about here? Keep what you've got by give it away, right? Because I didn't feel at that time in my life I had a lot to give. So it was quite a strange experience. But as I started to connect with people, and then as I received help and support, and other people started to kind of link in with me, and I was able to help others, it generated this idea, this community kind of idea of, whilst what we're talking about today is addiction, but just broadly in our communities today, this is that connection that we have with each other that really helps us, celebrate the great times, get through the tough times. So I was really curious about that connection, but also I think what really struck me was my own sense of isolation.
Mm,
When I first started to try and kind of do something different in my life, I felt in a very kind of isolated space, in a very lonely space, and it wasn't due to the lack of people trying to reach in. It was due to my lacking ability to connect, really.
yeah. Oh, I relate to that completely.
Yeah, and because it felt like a huge risk. It felt like a huge risk. And I know we'll talk a lot about this, I suppose, today, between the two of us and as we move forward. But I remember kind of people talking about, feeling connected and things like mutual aid, be part of a fellowship. But a lot of the things that were kind of rolling around within me, I couldn't help but think some of the experiences that were still haunting me, sitting with me, or re-traumatizing me were in connection with others because of the lifestyle I'd been involved in. So I had this theoretical knowledge of, right, if you can connect with people, it's really good because it'll help. But I had this internal kind of intrapsychic process and a very emotionally charged process of risk and shame and fear around being able to do that, and finding kind of my sense of self. So I was walking this planet really projecting out wildly what I was holding internally that I didn't think much of me and I didn't think you would think much of me. So this grabbed my kind of attention, the disconnection, the working in the sector, the wanting to learn. Um, and as I started to work in the sector and meet more and more people, It was just it was inspiring. It was informing. It helped me develop. You know, there were people I've met along the way that have challenged me. And I think what it did do was start to open these big wide doors, saying there's a world out there. You know, so who are you going to be in this world? So that was part of that process, that kind of early embers of getting me into the treatment sector, wanting to do that reciprocal side to things. But then there was this big developmental learning process that came with it that was scary, frightening, wonderful, joyful. It was, you know, all of the above. Um, yeah, so that was part of it.
That's interesting because I think too what you just highlighted is you said, I knew all the information, the theory, et cetera, but then doing it. And I have to talk about this all the time. Like just because we know the information, we know the skills, we know the competencies, we know the value of it, but like having the ability to apply that learning and take action is a different, and I think sometimes that's a gap. Like, you even highlighted it yourself. So, and it's like, yes, I know connection is good for me, but how do we create intentional connections? And that's a great question on its own.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think sometimes what I've learned over the years is that you know, I've been in places where people have tried to answer that question, and I don't think it's one of those questions that has an answer.
Because
It
they'll be
is,
different.
yeah, it's that's what kind of was drawing me back, and it reminds me early on of thinking, because somebody said to me, because of I suppose my experience, my lived experience, they said, oh, you know how to do this, so you can help me do it. I said, and it really dawned on me, it's like I kind of knew what I had to do for Andy. I don't know what you're gonna have to do for you, but I can walk alongside you until you figure that out. You know, that was the bit that struck me, was that's what people did for me. I didn't have people around me telling me what to do per se. There's plenty of advice,
Yeah.
but what they did was they walked alongside me. And occasionally it was that relational side to just bouncing off people, just kind of keep the learning curve going, the ups and downs, the one step forward, the two steps back, but having that safe environment. And I think safety, you know, we are talking about trauma today, is crucial. You know, in any
Yeah.
environment, whether we're thinking about treatment, whether we're thinking about mutual aid, whether we're thinking about other kind of resources that people have within their lives and communities, it's that safety side to things. Because, you know, if you're carrying that really low sense of self, it's just everything's a risk, because you know you don't really want to re-feel those deep emotions of not feeling good enough in the world and not feeling connected, and that sense of isolation.
It's interesting because you're throwing up some terms, and I'm like, oh man, we're good. Because you just brought it up. You just
Have
said
we drifted off already? It's like,
yeah, like kind of, but you just said safety. And so I think this is very interesting because I deliver training education, and the word safety is used everywhere, right? And you hear let's create a safe space. And I always say the way you define safety versus every other person in this room looks very different. So, can I guarantee that I can ensure that every single one of y'all feels safe? Honestly, I can, because that looks very different. And so, I always push back and encourage, can we create a brave space where we can feel brave to have conversations, to feel brave to say what we think or feel? Because I can't guarantee anybody's safety. We can hope to provide safety, but can we guarantee
yeah.
safety? And
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you've just kind of echoed something. But recently, I've been delivering, like over the last couple of years, you know, I've been delivering training around like trauma awareness, and a colleague has been working alongside me. We've been developing a supervision qualification, and when we deliver the training, that's exactly what we say at the beginning: is look, you know, what we want is everyone to look after themselves. We're talking about subject matter that could evoke anything, so there's no way we can do this training and that not happen. And it may happen and it may not. However, what we want to do is create a space where it feels permissive to do what you need to do to look after you.
yeah,
We're always open to feedback. I honestly think that's one of the reasons that mutual aid worked really well for me early on, because it didn't tell me what to do. It let me create my own safety. I could go and share if I wanted to. I could just rock up and have a cup of tea. I could go this week if I wanted to. I didn't have to go next week if I didn't want to. There was no kind of like rigidity that said, you are going through this. This is what it's like. And that flexibility within that mutual aid network allowed me to grade. It allowed me to go, okay. In regards to exposure, if I'd have walked into a meeting and someone had said, right, you're doing a share tonight, terror, absolute terror. If I
yeah,
like sit at the back of the meeting, let me listen. Let me
yeah.
connect. Let me meet a few people during the break when I'm having a cup of tea.
Yeah.
You know, let me just identify with stuff to recognize myself in what other people are, to help me get a narrative, help me start to make sense and meaning. And it was that graded approach, and that's something I've advocated for, whether it be, support groups within treatment, outside of that, anything that people do. Even, I've met people that have said, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the gym. I said, grade it. Please don't do 100 times a week and then none the next week after,
Yeah,
It's
like
like just
New
grade
Year's
it.
resolutions. You start your
New Year's
goals in your heart
resolution.
the first week, and then you're like, I got whatever. I think
Yeah.
it's interesting too, because even for me, I even think about the foundational principles and values. So, you know, if I always go back to like the values and principles, that seems easy where versus more rigid, do this, do that. But it's like I can be open-minded, I can be curious, I can have gratitude, I can have integrity. And
Yeah.
and I get to like discover, because honestly, in early recovery, my honesty looked different than my honesty today, years down the line. My mom always says, you were as honest as you could be at that time. But the foundational principles, I think that's a really great starting point, even to give more adaptability and flexibility with that.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think that's the challenge. I think what you've just described there, Calliese, is a challenge, particularly when we think about treatment services. Because I mean, I always start this conversation around the kind of treatment. I've been very fortunate to work with some of the most amazing, passionate people who literally get out their bed in the morning to see if they can help that person. And I think that the challenge is how do we do that in a system? How do we have that flexibility and that gradient to do, that kind of work in a system relationally with people?
Mm.
When we deliver the training, we often talk about, so in treatment services, for instance, when we think about the prescribing of methadone, often the clinical team will talk about titration. Let's get that balance right and let's make it work for you. It's like, well, we need relational titration as well. This is what we need.
Yeah. Oh,
We need to be
relational
able
titration.
yeah,
That's
we need to be able
interesting.
to grade this, and I think because of the current demand on services and the challenges that are faced, these are all really kind of noble statements, and it's really difficult, to be able to achieve now because of where the system is at, and the resource within that. It's really difficult to have that space with people to be able to process relationally kind of what is happening for them because. I've always been a huge advocate, of the integrated nature of everything that we do. Whether you're
Yeah.
attending mutual aid, whether you're going into treatment services, whether you've got a great group of friends that are helping you make sense of it, is yeah, we need to do it safe and we need to be healthy and well because, sadly, we know about the statistics. We know about the amount of people that we're losing every year to drugs and alcohol. We see the data coming out of government saying, the biggest issues that hospitals are facing right now are alcohol entries. We know that, the contributing factors to kind of the largest loss of underage 50-year-olds is due to kind of substance. We know how bad that is,
Hmm.
and we've got to do some and particularly from a medical standpoint, we've done some amazing stuff to be able to move forward and say there are safe ways of supporting people, no matter where you found yourself in life, no matter what cocktail or recipe has emerged for you, particularly around substances. There's some amazing stuff that's happening right now. And I just think we're on this precipice of we need to go at that level with the psychological, the relational, the therapeutic side now. We need to go really into that and start pushing and saying, okay, so how do we help people make sense of meaning of this relationship that we call addiction? How do we help them? And with today's theme in mind, because I've often been intrigued. I've talked to people about trauma in the sector, and there's a very kind of at times you can hear a very kind of crass understanding where people say something really bad happened to me when I was younger, therefore I got into a relationship with substance because it does X, Y, and Z for me, or that kind of stuff, which is absolutely true. And you can look at Bruce Perry's work around big T's and little T's in trauma. It doesn't have to be a big event that happened. Actually, I mentioned the colleague of mine, Ange, that we're working together. We often talk about those small T's, or I suppose those disguised big T's of just the emissions, what wasn't around for you, the losses, the losses of parents when you're young, the difference that happens in your lives, that connection that you had or didn't have with your parents that helped you emotionally regulate and make sense of yourself in the world. So there's all this stuff that's happening, and when people come into treatment in a non-assumptive way is like, how do we create a space to help someone say, okay, we know you've got this relationship with substances. Why? What's happening for you? You know, how do we create that space to help people make sense of meaning and not in a prescriptive way? Because I'm sure everyone, you know, hopefully everyone will be different and it's not just a recipe out there. Um, but to understand, I remember being in a mutual aid meeting and someone really, really bluntly said, you know, what I had to ask myself was, what was drugs doing for me that I couldn't do for myself? And I thought that is a great starting point, as much
Yeah,
as
thank
it
you.
just because it opens the door to separating the relationship as well. It's like it's not just me and drugs. This partnership for life is like, what
Yeah.
are you
We're
doing
not
for me?
married,
Yeah,
you
yeah. But and I've seen that in treatment sectors. I mean, I've been fortunate to work in residential treatment
know.
sectors and mainstream treatment and also be part of a lot of like lived experience organization work. And I've seen it in different guises where people have literally done the Dear John letter to their addiction. They've said, look, dear addiction, we may have had some amazing times. We may have some fantastic stories to tell. We may have done things that would make people chuckle and laugh until the kind of end of the evening. However, it's now coming at a cost. And me and you are gonna have to go separate ways, you know. But that's that open door to saying, okay, you understand that relationship with substances was doing something for you. And I think for a lot of people, you know, not everyone, but for a lot of people, this is where we do stumble into that trauma conversation of
Yeah.
emotional regulation, what's happening, and particularly I do like Alan Shaw's work on the external locus of control.
Mm.
Because I think a lot of people within addiction look out there and regulate themselves out there, not in here. If that's okay, I'm okay. Or with substances, desensitization and dissociation. So I think it doesn't fit exactly. But if you look at Alan Shaw's work on the external locus of control and link that to trauma, I think anybody out there that's supporting people, that's listening to this, if you're working with people, that might really help, you know, garner an understanding of how to support people. Because I think if we can bring that external locus of control internal, because again, this fits with things like stigma, you know, that intrapsychic script that we have, that the belief system we have about ourselves that we've developed ourselves, but also been fed by others.
Yeah,
You know,
our
I remember
culture,
being,
our surroundings, our influences,
oh,
etc.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember being in treatment and it was like, hey, you've got a really negative sense of self. I said, look, I don't think a lot of me right now. And guess what? There are people queuing up outside of me to tell me they don't like me right now.
Yeah.
You know, so if it's a case of like integrating the feedback and like somatically taking all of that in, I've not got a lot of good stuff coming in right now. So hey, guess what you get? You get me saying I'm not worth much,
Yeah. Interesting.
you know?
Before I go into my next question, I like to help try to provide clarity in in simple terms. So, in your most simplest way, can you define trauma? Give us Andy's definition for trauma so everybody can fully have some clarity as we move forward.
Yeah. You see, yeah, for me, there's something about trauma being an experience. And in that moment of the experience, there being that risk to self. Now, whether that be a physical risk, whether it be a psychological risk, in its simplest forms, I just think that that's what it is for me. In those moments around trauma, you know, I've kind of listened to people that have talked about being in physical accidents, you know, car accidents and stuff like that. And in that moment, they thought that, you know, and it really does shock the system, both
Naturally.
somatically, cognitively. Lots can be happening there. We know about PTSD. We know, so that kind of like in those momentary risks, again, which is why I talk a lot about trauma bonding, because I think in those moments of crisis, things can happen for us. And I think that's where a relationship with substance can be really cemented. You know, because when you feel vulnerable, if something offers a sense of safety, security, dissociation, then a bond can be built. So that's in its simplest form. That's what it is. Is that too simple, Calliese? Have I just? Is it like?
No, I think the thing is that it is very diverse and it is very broad. And so we want to ensure that we can provide clarity that's encompassing to all experiences. I think that would be the way that I would try to communicate. I mean, I
Yeah,
think maybe your definition did kind of keep it broad enough to ensure that there's a
yeah. Because I
connectivity
think
there.
it's really organic, isn't it? It's like, and this is why. Again, one of the slogans from one of the mutual aid meetings, and I've heard a lot of people talk about, "There, but for the grace of God, go I."
Mm,
And again, I just for context, I didn't grow up around any kind of religion or faith. In fact, the council estate I grew up on, I would say was quite anti-religion and faith. You know, some
wow.
stuff that I've had to process out really, you know, and get a grip of. It's like, you know, I grew up with people that like say did go to church. That there was a lot of criticism of that, a lot of judgment of that. you
Mm,
and I think I also grew up in an era where there was a lot of racism, which was often targeted at people's religions, and misdirected, and yeah, so there was a lot of that awfulness around too. So I kind of grew up in that space. So religion wasn't figural for me, but when someone said there, but for the grace of God, I got curious. I started listening. It was a case of it totally fits with trauma.
mm,
I don't know what's going to happen to me today. I don't know what's going to happen to me tomorrow. And organically, I've got this wonderful system in me that will protect me. I have trauma responses, and that could be anything, and I would argue, some days more heartedly than others, that addiction is a threat response, it's a trauma response.
definitely. So this webinar is around the cost of disconnection. In your view, what's the biggest cost we don't often see, whether to individuals, communities, or whole systems?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that springs to mind for me with that, and it's probably it is definitely linked with my own experience, but also just thinking of the years of work in the sector. The biggest cost of addiction is the breakdown of family and community for me.
I
When
agree.
I've seen, you know, even when people have managed to kind of, like, say, make sense and meaning of what's been happening for them, but the reparation within the family or the community has never been quite made, and the loss of all of that, the intergenerational loss of all of that as well. I think that's that brings me the greatest sadness.
Mm,
It really does. And I think, sometimes, from a humanistic point of view, bridges can't be built. A lot of things happen that are very harmful, that are very hurtful. Um, but then I think that does impact us. It does impact us as a nation, as communities. There's a breakdown in there. And yeah, I would say that's one of the biggest things that I see that's really sad to see. And what I would put subtitles underneath that, by the way, I would, say we do not invest anywhere near enough money in family support.
oh my gosh, I agree with that. Like, I love
Yeah.
family, and I'm very fortunate that, I live in a house of four generations. So my son reads bedtime stories with his great grandma. Like those, he's going to remember that for the rest of his life. And
Yeah.
I think about, we cook it around the table and we laugh and that's it's just,
Yeah.
I don't know, there's something beautiful about that.
And that's my biggest kind of sadness is seeing that when that does impact and it fractures, and particularly in communities. I mean, obviously we could probably talk about data around deprivation and life chances, and where we see, unfortunately or sadly, the kind of highest rates of people kind of losing their lives in different communities. But this can absolutely ravage communities. I've watched documentaries on old kind of mining towns that have been hit by kind of heroin addiction, and you just think the intergenerational impact of what once was a very close community, the kind of like, people doing stuff for each other, people, and it
Mm,
it just breaks down all of that and builds barriers really,
yeah.
which is not great for us socially.
Yeah, definitely. Especially like when we as humans need connection and relations and love.
Absolutely.
So we've been talking about how disconnection isn't just personal, it's really wide. Can you share an example of how you've seen systems unintentionally mirror the very wounds they're meant to heal? Ooh.
Oh, oh, oh. And if there is anybody listening to this that knows me, they'll probably know what's coming next. Um, and there's no way I'll get through this sentence without saying the word parallel process. There's just absolutely no way. Um,
Okay.
and it's something that, like I've always said, and I said at the beginning, you know, I I've worked in treatment systems with people that are absolutely amazing. I don't think that's ever in doubt. I think there's smarter ways of working in the treatment system. That's but the energy that people have and the lengths that they go to. I mean, arguably sometimes, we're sailing very close to HR conversations and boundary issues because people want to help that much. There's times over the years there. Um, but I think interestingly, where we're at right now is what we're seeing is probably a system in trauma, as well as the people that walk through the door. So I kind of often listen to narrative. I'm big on listening to narrative, and I'm aware as well. And again, if people are listening to this and you want to contradict me, please do, because like I say, I practice what I preach. I'm totally up for learning, and if you've got some wisdom to share with me, please do. Um, But I listen to people kind of come in telling me that they don't feel enough, or there's never enough substance and there's never enough. And then the system's saying there's not enough. We haven't got enough. There's never enough. There's not enough time. There's not enough space. We haven't got. And I think we're kind of struggling on this resource. It's almost this script has been built and it's passing through layers of like a parallel process of never enough, never enough. How was the addiction, how was the relationship formed in people's lives? Probably through the absence of things,
Mm,
like a good relationship or like support or traumatic events. And I
mhm.
think, you know, are we doing enough to stop people living that daily traumatic event of being in addiction? Are we doing enough so that the frequency of support that we offer helps people build bond and attachment? Or are people seeing us so infrequently that we're repeating something from their life? It's like, you're about as much in my life now as a treatment service as my family was when I was younger.
Wow.
There's a lot of things that you think actually, and by the way, I'm not that's not meant as a criticism of a treatment. So I think sometimes it's just about starting to look at it and go, hey, does that then present us with a problem here? No, it potentially does. And not for everyone. Like I was saying earlier, some of it's about grading. I know some people that the infrequency of appointments has worked really well for them while they figure out
Yeah.
why they're in treatment and why they want to go to mutual aid, or why they're doing what they're doing. So it's not an absolute for everything. But I think the system, and obviously with the Dame Carol Black review recently, there was some really kind of salient points pulled out about the need of the service. The caseloads are too big. What we need to be doing is more of this. There's a challenge to the services. There's extra funding been put in. That's the government's response was, well, we are way light here. Let's get some more funding in here to help people see what we can do. With a drive to, getting more people into treatment that are just not there. And I think again, there's probably underrepresented groups all across the country that aren't in treatment right now, or don't have the available information about every bit of support that's out there.
Yeah. Not everybody wants to go to a drug service, why don't we
Absolutely not.
create opportunities that are accessible to all?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you get into the kind of conversations around cultural sensitivity and,
Mm,
are we providing a service saying, look, hey, if you've got a problem with addiction, here we are, and this is what we offer. Well, that doesn't work for me because of my age or my religious beliefs or my geography or my, I always have this. I had it when I was working in the sector. I used to give myself a hard time with it. It's like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, but I think we can do better.
mm,
you know I'm not expecting a perfect treatment system, because that, a bit like recovery, that is not well, I wasn't in recovery and now I am. We didn't have
yeah.
a perfect treatment system and now we do. No, no, it doesn't exist like that. This is a bumpy landing, and we need to kind of keep motivating forward and understand that. But I do think knowledge of trauma, if they are going to kind of review particularly the psychosocial offers and the therapeutic offers and the psychological offers, I think the knowledge of trauma needs to be embedded in there, not just about what we offer as a treatment, how is more important.
Mm.
There's plenty of evidence base out there saying different modalities, but you get the how right. Watch what happens with people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I think about it too. Like I'm always like, what's involved? How does this connect with other things? Break it down. It's interesting though, because my immediate response, or whenever I think about that question, is funding. Like we see organizations and they end up, say I'm a drug service and I'm supporting people through addiction. I end up chasing the funding. It's like I'm addicted to chasing the funding. Like I got to get more. Oh, I just got this one. I'm addicted to, and it's like, but aren't we're these what what are we doing here? Because we got
Yep.
it. I like that's the first thing that pops into my mind whenever I think
Yeah, yeah,
about mirroring behaviors and
yeah.
patterns.
And again, I know it can be a sensitive conversation. It's definitely been a sensitive conversation for me working in the sector. But I think as well, from that perspective, you just have to put your hands up and say there are pressures that have been put on the system. There's
Yeah.
financial. I've heard the phrase "the kind of race to the bottom" mentioned loads of times, and it sends a
Wow.
shiver through my spine,
That is
thinking,
scary. Race
somebody
to
said
the
that about my service when I was kind of looking after services. It would have broke my heart. It's like, you think this is a race to the bottom service? It's like, oh no, please, you know.
bottom.
I need to look at myself to make sure I'm not doing that. Because the reality is with public health and the way that services are funded,
Yeah.
particularly in England, it is what it is. This is the funding that's available. That's what you'll get, and this is what we're trying to achieve with it. That's the reality to where we're at right now. I
Yeah.
think a more honest conversation, and what would be really helpful, are some of the providers within the country starting to speak up and say, hey, if you want this service to really be as effective as possible,
That's what it is.
this is where we need to go.
That's what it is. Because see, look, I can have empathy and compassion and understanding for like, for example, the chasing the funding thing. Look, if we were to look at a human, I need housing, I need food, I need water. An organization needs to have funding to pay the staff to do the
Yeah.
job. So it's like that's a necessity needed.
Yeah.
So there it comes because it's a high need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also very aware of please, anybody listening to this, don't think that I think for some reason that this is a sector that deserves it and others don't. I know that all sectors at the minute are facing financial pressures beyond anything they've seen
Oh
before,
yeah,
beyond anything. So this isn't a prioritizing of particularly of addiction services, maybe a passion of mine to prioritize addiction services. But I'm very aware at the minute, unfortunately and sadly, that we're in a position where there are big restrictions out there and people genuinely are doing the best with what they've been given.
hey, what we've been this ain't our first rodeo. We know how to build, houses out of sticks. Like we know how to make it work.
Yeah, yeah,
That's it.
absolutely, yeah. Because my hope and ambition has been that, like I was talking about, the system being kind of traumatized. I think it is in shock. It's like being asked to do so much with so little resource.
Mm,
And you do see innovation. Occasionally you'll see innovation where the pressure's been applied and something good emerges from that. But actually, having been in the system for so long, I think the ship has sailed a little on that. I think, people are doing everything they can with the resources they've got, but they're literally now saying, well, this is where we're at. And a lot of things that I read about where people talk about innovation, sometimes it's rebranded, things that have happened before, and sometimes it's change, not necessarily innovation.
mm,
And I think what we need to do is make sure that we're not just shuffling things around so they look different, but actually it's the same outcome. And again, when you go back to the addiction, you walk into a meeting and people say, repeat the same behavior, you get the same
we're
result.
gonna hire 800 people to keep doing what we've always been
Yeah,
doing.
yeah. But this time
That's
we're going
our
to do it
innovate.
this way
But this is
round.
innovative.
That's it. Yep. And we're not going to do this. We're going to do that instead. We're going to, but how much time do I get with the client? Still the same time, but we're going to do this instead of, it's like, okay, right. I understand what you're trying to do. And like I say, occasionally there might be an innovation. There might be a methodology of therapy, like, acceptance commitment therapy, or something emerges where you think, wow, that's effective. This is really helping people. So never kind of against that view to look for difference or to look for change. But again, I just think at the minute that my felt sense of the system is it there's not a lot of water left in that sponge. It's been
Oh,
squeezed.
mm,
Now some genuine kind of resource, and particularly with all the learning that we've had over the years from a medical perspective, with some of the amazing developments there. If we put that amount of effort into the psychological side now, and really start to learn about effective treatment from that perspective, then that could be a system changer.
interesting. So on that note around trauma, how does unresolved trauma in leaders or practitioners ripple outward into the services they design and deliver?
I,
Oh, that's a good question.
that is a good question. Yeah, it's a very good question. Anyone would think we'd planned this, Calliese.
I mean, I'm just thinking, like, what am I doing maybe that I don't even have awareness of or something?
Yeah,
Honestly, because
yeah.
I like to look at the mirror. Come on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But my starting point for this is on the supervision training we offer. We often talk about, and we have a brief discussion as well at times about why do you work in the sector? What is it that, why do you work in the sector? And 9 times out of 10, different kind of style of answer, but different. What does shine through is the compassion, the empathy, the passion. Some people kind of in the room either have direct lived experience or families and friends of that's drawn
Yeah.
into that sector, really want to work, really want to help, really want to. And that's where we always flag up that is an open door for things like vicarious and secondary trauma when you work in the sector. If you if you work in this sector and day after day you listen to people who tell you some of the harrowing stories of both living in the day, what it actually takes to fund, to fuel, to exist next to an addiction process, as well as anything historic, um, that can become overwhelming. And I think what the risk is then is within the system, we then start to see, and this is for me, this is the paradox, working in public health to help and support the health and well-being of people walking through the doors. The risk is that we then see the impact on the health and well-being of the team.
Yes. We have
So
to take
what
care of our people.
that's it. So rather than really doing that as we are doing that real kind of support for the person that's walking through the door, what we have to make sure is, the person that's in that service, that works in that service, no matter who you are, whether you're kind of the manager, part of the finance team, the admin, recovery worker, how are you doing? And when you
Mm-hmm.
meet someone, how aware are you of who you are in that relationship with someone? Because if you are frustrated, if your caseload is too high, if your manager's asking too much for you, if your manager is under pressure because the KPIs are asking too much of him, all of that pressure, that kind of felt sense of disappointment, of fear sometimes, of
Mm-hmm.
it will start to manifest itself. And I think within the sector, and this happens, I've seen this happen in mutual aid meetings, I've seen it pan out in different ways, is you can end up with this kind of rub of I care about who I am and I'm really frustrated. Now, for me, what often gets linked there is things like people say, oh, that's burnout. You're going to burn out. This is what will happen here. Also, what can happen is you start to get some very toxic behavior in the system,
Oh yeah.
passive and toxic behavior in the system, some very punitive behavior in the system where,
Fear-based management.
yeah, and it's frightening. And what I always remind people of is, and at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock, whenever your kind of service opens and closes, you're going home and you've got the family pressures, you've got the life. So
Mm-hmm.
I might be sitting in a meeting today with people talking about, the cost of living crisis, the financial pressures, the fact that people can't pay their gas and their electric. And some of the workers around that table might be sitting there going, tell me about it, you know? And then you get yourself into a therapeutic position of something that kind of I refer to as proflection, is you're then giving support to others that you most need yourself.
Interesting, because it sounds what I'm hearing is it sounds a lot around culture too. I'm hearing a lot of things that relate to culture and what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, when we do the supervision training, we talk about being culture carriers, because
Interesting.
again, I've worked in services and look, I'll put my hand up. I've done this. Bloody CEO.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's ruining this. That's what's ruining this charity. Yeah.
Yeah.
You mean that person 3 steps away from you who you very rarely see is ruining the atmosphere in the office?
Yeah. I could do
Eh,
their job better than them,
I do-
like
Yeah. Who's actually in the office, Andy? You are. Okay. So how's about you do something about the culture by being part of it and contributing to that? And actually having that kind of open dialogue and conversations about some of the frustrations, about some of the things that are happening for you. And also, just to mention as well, and again, if you're listening, you'll know who you are if you've sat in training with me because we've talked about this and sometimes have a laugh. We can be blooming awful at celebrating things. When I say to people, kind of one of my opening conversations when I deliver training, we do what I used to see in the mutual aid rooms where they would do the kind of sobriety count. And they
okay.
say, how many years, how many years, how many years? And I remember the first time it dawned on me because I was in a room and they said, oh, that's what was it? It was like 98 years of sobriety. And I was thinking, I can't do a day. It's like there's 98 years in here. I can't even do a day without promising myself I'm not going to when I do.
Hmm.
So I'm sticking around here. What are you guys doing that I'm not?
Yeah.
What do you know that I don't? And I do it with the team. How many years have you worked in addiction services? And when we deliver training, we get figures back like 150, 200,
Yeah.
250 years of working in treatment services. And I think that's some serious lived experience of being in treatment services. How do we look after you then as you're on that
Mm.
journey? How do we learn from you and the knowledge that you've got? And through all those years of work and support in this room, you've heard so much from people. How do you process? How does this not become a very traumatizing job? So we, like you say, it's about the culture. Let's talk about this stuff. Let's not, oh, I'm fine. I'm good. I'm fine because I've got to be positive because I'm here to help people.
But
Some days I'm
also, like,
not.
why? Like, let's be honest. If we're honest, we're not all positive every day. Like, the fact that I have to put on a face says a lot about the culture I'm in. If I have to pretend to be somebody else.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I think it's just that balance, isn't it? And I think if we don't get that right, that's when it can become quite a traumatizing, like repetitive experiences, like every day. And I have worked with people over the years. I've worked with, I remember talking to a few people that were working in a hostel, and because of some of the things that were happening, and
Mm.
they were finding people that were overdosing. They were having to carry ligature cutters because of attempts to complete suicide, and you just think that's a really difficult job. But when I started speaking to them, what they acknowledged quite openly as we started to move forward was we've just hardened to the role. So it was announced that someone had passed away, and the narrative that came next to that was but we kind of knew that was going to happen because of what they were doing. And it's like, oh,
Wow.
but you knew that person and you cared about that person. That must hurt. And it did hurt. And there was a lot of sadness around that when we got there. But to survive in the sector, you kind of form a narrative, which is very familiar to addiction. Is like someone says, you've got a drink problem, you've got a drug problem. No, I haven't, because, and I have a narrative. I always had a narrative,
Mm,
that would dissolve anyone's argument for and make sure that I could continue doing what I was doing. And that happens in the sector as well. We form a narrative. And I think sometimes, and depending if you're working on services out there, you'll hear phrases like, complex people, hard to reach.
yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe
Yeah. So, if you could redesign one element of how recovery systems currently operate, what would you change first and why?
Wow. I'm just drinking that in. I would love.
Like, take the magic wand. Here's your magic
I
wand,
know.
baby. You
I
get.
know. I'm just absorbing some of that sense of that question. Is like, wouldn't that be an amazing and terrifying place to be? Um, for me, it's always the therapeutic side for me. I think there would have to be, I think, a change in the system in understanding how this would work because, and I'm a big advocate of this as well. I don't think just because somebody walks through, say, if somebody walks in mutual aid, it doesn't mean they're ready to recover yet. They're on that pathway. They're on that journey. You
Yeah.
know, if somebody walks into a treatment service, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want therapy. They want therapeutic intervention. So I'd resist the temptation of saying, do you know what? Let's get everyone into, because I know the timing ain't right. I'd be contradicting myself starting out today talking about titration and then saying, well, titration is all right until you give me the power and then everyone's getting into therapy. It's like,
Mm,
when the time is right. So I think we need a system of balances and checks, and we need a system that supports that kind of window of opportunity approach. So that if the reason that you're coming to a treatment service right now is for that level of stability or that medical intervention, that's fine. Hey, arguably, I'll even move that out to GP surgeries and say that's health. Let's move that to GP surgeries. I would put a system in place that was there to check in with people, and when the moment was right for them to say, do you know what? Now I'm ready to start making sense of my relationship. Now I'm psychologically stable enough. I want to do something about what I think is happening for me, or I just want to come to a place where I can experience that to begin that journey for myself. I've seen that happen in like residential, quasi-residential setups, really intense, and they cost money to be able to do it like that. So that would be the challenge. But if it was a case of, systemically, what do we need to do? That's, I think, where we need to go, is to start helping people make sense of their relationships and addiction. And alongside that, because we talk about life chances, we talk about recovery capital, that it's about, okay, that's a great picture for recovery moving forward. I remember someone doing it for me, and they didn't do it intentionally. It was one of my first key workers. They've told me about this wonderful, it was like doggy heaven. It was like, and this is where everyone goes, and it's brilliant, and it's fantastic, and recovery is great, and you'll be doing this, and you'll be doing that, and you'll be doing. I had about £3 in my pocket. I don't know when the last time I'd had a shower. I had numerous health consequences. I'd just come out of an unplanned entrance into hospital. I wasn't in recovery heaven, this wonderful kind of picture down. I wasn't anywhere
bubble.
near.
Yeah.
So what we need is that support to be able to say, and this is how we get there. Let's
Yeah.
do the real time stuff.
Yeah.
This is how we get there. So there is the psychological. You're going to need to make sense of this for yourself, because it's that age old thing that, again, I used to hear in mutual aid meetings. Anyone can stop. It's staying stopped is the problem. That was the big challenge. Is like I I think the first time I was talking to someone, and they kind of had about 19 detoxes, so many unplanned. And it was just, when I've had enough, I'll just do that. But then I'll just start using again, because nothing really changed around their relationship with substances. They were just really adamant they didn't want to do it now, but they knew it wasn't if but when. You know, and what they didn't realize was, and this was what blew my mind early on, was, the problem wasn't alcohol or drugs. The problem was the stuff that you kind of intrapsychically held, or what was happening for you in the world, those lack of life chances, all kind of coming together, meaning that you at some point would go, oh, what's the point? So we need a system that addresses that. And we've got stuff happening. We have IPS, we have kind of education to employment, we have things happening. But when teams are so stretched, we haven't got the resource to be able to do that really robust side, to being able to support people, get them engaged in their community, absolutely, with all the recovery support, but wider than that. It's like, I want you to be part of your community again. Yes, I want you to be part of the recovery group. Yes, I want you to be part of that Lero if you want to be part of it. Yes, get yourself to mutual aid. It's like that, as if someone would go to the gym or go to, but I want you to be part of your community again. You know, when I was in a treatment setup, and it was really interesting because we said it to each other when we were in there. And then when I ended up working in a residential place, the amount of people that I used to say to them, there was a lovely bridge near this residential centre. I said, "Oh, that bridge is really nice, isn't it?" And the amount of people go, "What bridge?" Because their head was down in the pavement when they were out in public. Never
Wow.
noticed it. Because being out in public was a challenge of itself, and when you're kind of suffering at that level, and arguably, and there will be kind of trauma experts that hopefully would agree here, when you're trying to minimize any triggers to re-traumatization, you reduce contact with the world. You
Yeah.
manage that contact with the world, and people were just surviving, and it's getting beyond that really. So, and that's why I'm more hopeful than I suppose cynical at times in that I think there's some ingredients out there with some of the resources we've got, but we probably need a more thoroughly honest conversation about what recovery looks like in for individuals, for families, for communities, and how we could truly achieve that.
Yeah. Well said. So, where have you seen recovery spaces truly become places of reconnection, and what made that possible?
It feels like it feels like the answer's in the question. When you say connection, it's like, yeah, am I just going to repeat something here? Because we've mentioned today, I think I was blown away by some of the kind of the empathy, the kindness, the caringness in mutual aid meetings. I was like, this is really good, because I genuinely thought mutual aid was going to be like treatment, was going to be like
Mm.
you go there and something is done to you, get a sponsor, something's done to you.
Well, that's like that depends on where you go to mutual aid meetings at, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. But it was really interesting, and like you say, kind of depending on which meetings you go to. But they were a social space, really. The ones I went to, people were having a cup of tea, they were having a chat, they were talking about life, they were talking about kind of beyond that. And I think that was the key for me. It wasn't people weren't kind of gathering somewhere in a room to talk about surviving addiction.
Mm.
They were actually going to talk about, and that age-old structure of, whenever people are speaking about lived experience of addiction, you're asked to talk about your experience, your strength, and your hope. Really, that kind of old structure from mutual aid, and particularly with AA. It was like, but people weren't embedded in the experience. They weren't just telling stories about how bad addiction was. I was really fortunate that there were a lot of people around talking about strength and hope.
Mm.
I'm now going to university. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. That's what helps me connect with this. I'm going to rebuild my life. This is the stuff I always wanted to do, and this is a strength to do it. I remember the first time I went to college just to get a basic qualification. I turned around and walked away. I was frightened to walk into a classroom because my projection was, as much as I chuckle at it today, it was terrorizing at the time that I was, around 28 years old. I was going to walk into this college, and lots of young people were going to go, "What are you doing here? What happened to you?" So that was my projection, which never happened when I eventually got there. Um, but it was about that. So those spaces there, I think some of the work that's happening in like so mentioned in the kind of the Clearo work, that College for Lived Experience Recovery organizations, they've got a website. You can go on there, you can see all these organizations popping up now that create spaces for people to connect. Be part of your community. If that's that stepping stone. My only hope is that that's what it is. It's a stepping stone to being kind of wider than that. Let's get you involved in things in your community again. Let's get you back into employment if that's what you're looking for. Let's get that education that, you were robbed of once the addiction relationship took over, that
Mm.
kind of stuff. And I think what I'd like to see more of, though, is workplaces.
Mm.
That's the work for me moving forward because my fear, and this probably fits with the trauma lens today, is I had a conversation early on when I was starting to do some work around um, kind of trauma informed processes, looking at some of the kind of I don't know the principles out there for trauma informed. I was, fortunate enough to work with a group of people that were looking at psychologically informed environments. So I was learning all the time. And I was really kind of thinking, well, what is it to create a kind of safe environment, and why are we creating these bubbles? And again, this is purely timing. I was reading something online, and there was an online webinar, and there was someone on there talking about their kind of work within a system, and there was a really fruitful conversation where they said, you know what, we don't need trauma informed services, we need trauma informed societies.
Yeah.
This is a culture thing, bigger than a service, and arguably, and my point, kind of in the keyboard warrior style, put a comment in the text of the webinar, was, and arguably, if you create a trauma-informed environment or a safe space, a protected space, what happens when people leave that? That can be just as traumatizing. So I've heard people have kind of those experiences when leaving residential rehabs. It's been very difficult in transition back. We just need to get it right. But I thought actually what we need to do is move into being more trauma informed. So these aren't big steps, because if you leave residential rehab, you're going back into a community that understands addiction. And in fact,
Mm.
it's celebrated the way it should be celebrated. I had a problem. I chose to do something about it, just in anything in life.
I think it's interesting because when I asked you that question, you talked about, connection, and you talked about mutual aid and different groups and things like that. And I think that's great. And that's what we hope to happen. But I'll tell you, if I'm being honest from my own experience, a lot of times you still don't feel included because guess what? Those groups have also created their own subcultures,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that the unwritten rules and expectations and who gets to be included and who is not included. And so even the places that, for example, I'm just going to use your example, the places that I should be going to find connection, I am excluded from.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so so if we're being really honest about it, there's another situation because even the answer you just gave, I'm like, well, I've been excluded from a lot of those places, or
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah. And for every person that I could speak to now and tell you about, I've also witnessed. So, for instance, in mutual aid, I've witnessed the hierarchy form in there, and
yeah, I've seen it too.
even down to, and I genuinely had to take a step back from this, where people were comparing lengths of time that they'd been in recovery. And I think, what does that mean?
Or
Does it?
different pathways of recovery.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Or even different substances when you get kind of mute. Yeah, I've asked,
yeah,
I was once witness to someone who came to an NA meeting who said, I just needed a meeting. I have a problem with alcohol, but I really needed a meeting. And they was asked not to come. And you think, wow,
why?
because they're alcohol.
So
And
what? See, this drives me
I
crazy.
know, but that's the humanness to all this, isn't it? That's not NA, that's not AA, that's not. It's like when you look at fellowship, that's what people do with some of this messaging and twist it and turn it. So yeah, I totally take your point, and absolutely, I wouldn't want to skip down that road of saying, this is great, because arguably for me, and I think you mentioned earlier as well, that kind of idea of, the other week I was standing in the kitchen making an apple pie with my son. That'll do. There's been days in my life where I thought kind of it was days or weeks. There's been people kind of medically telling me that's how long I've got left. If
Hmm.
I keep doing what I'm doing, and that connection, that kind of the family. There's I've got a neighbour that always has a laugh with me. When I go out, take the bins out, and that we see each other, we're always having a laugh together. And I think I've lived in neighbourhoods where people would cross the street if they said we're coming.
I think it's like the small little sparks and moments, I don't know. Because, yeah, it is just really interesting. Because if we're talking about, we're talking about this, and I'm like, how many other people have felt like, had tried to seek connection, and then they felt worse. Maybe they felt they weren't seen, they weren't heard, they weren't valued. And then actually, so them going to that place where they were supposed to find connection actually did the opposite and made
Yeah,
them,
yeah. And that's going back to what we started talking about at the beginning. That's that risk of, particularly around if you've got experiences of trauma and abandonment, that risk of repetition in all of that. And I think, and that's whenever I've spoke to people where, so for instance, in England, we had a few years back, we had a big push around facilitating access to mutual aid, encourage people to go to mutual aid. And a lot of people come back saying, it's not for me. And it's like, okay,
okay,
that's fine. It's not going to be a case of well that's you not in recovery then. It's like, okay, let's just process of elimination. Let's go and find what works then.
that's what I say to people. Look, try it if you don't. It's like my son with his food. Try it once. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it again.
Absolutely,
See what you
absolutely. And
think.
then you're reducing that risk of kind of repetition of rupture as well. And that's the thing for me is like, if I make a stance and saying I'm sorry, this is the only way. There's no room for movement there. When actually I've never occupied that place of thinking, there is a route into recovery and this is what it is. You kind of got to find that. I hear a lot of people talking about, being ready or just the right things, right place, right time, whatever it is. You've got the big book talked about spiritual awakenings. You've got, however you decide to frame and reference this, it's a very individual, personal process. And sadly, as I'm sure lots of family members will attest to, which is really traumatizing, watching someone you love and being completely powerless to be able to stop it from happening. You know, I remember when that dawned on. I've always had a passion. I've worked with some colleagues in family support for many years, and I was curious as to why I have a real passion for supporting family support. I remember talking in therapy once about this, and it emerged. It was this might not make total sense, so please bear with me, Calliese.
Okay.
But my kind of logic was, I went through the process I went through, and for the majority of time, not only could I not remember a lot of it, but I was very dissociated and desensitized. The people that loved me weren't. They watched it all. They
Mm,
came to the hospital. They picked me up from the police station. They watched relationships around me crumble. They watched me behave in a way that, as I was told, we love you, we do not like what you're doing.
yeah.
They saw a lot of that and they weren't desensitized and dissociated from it all.
Yeah.
And they were getting to that place that sadly a lot of family members get to, where when the phone rings,
Panic.
that could be the call.
Yeah.
And I think, when I think of my own children today, when I think of, oh, that's pulled my heart out.
I couldn't imagine my son, and the things I put my mom through.
It's like I have this thing about me where, for some reason, no matter how fragile I've been and for the mistakes I've made in life, I feel like I could do anything. And it's like I would move mountains for my kids, but yeah, that's only if the mountains are accessible, Andy. In an addiction, they're not.
Mhm.
People were around you and they couldn't move mountains because it's an equation that strangely, whilst there's an influence, whilst there's a nudge that can come from there, and notwithstanding, I'm sure a lot of people have been inspired by conversations with family or just witnessing some of the sad events that's motivated them to change. Not always the case, and I think and again, that goes back to what we were saying earlier about the level of support that's needed for families. Is I years ago in the treatment sector, where people talked about families as being part of the recovery plan. No, families need support.
Mhm.
Yes, we need to integrate and connect, because that's the real long-standing kind of relationship. If families can build the bridges again, oh, amazing. That's the stuff. But families need that time and space to be able to process what the hell have they just been pulled through.
And I think that, I mean, that point is so imperative. And I even think about, my mom was getting family support two years before I like got recovery and stabilized. And even then, like talking about boundaries and stuff. And she had told me once, she said, oh, I was only able to set the boundaries and maintain the boundaries whenever I could accept all of the consequences. And that meant that yes, you could have got recovery and lived your life and gone off and done well. But I also had to accept the consequences that you might go back out and you might die. And like
Wow.
like hearing my mom saying, like, I had to work on myself to get to the point where I had to accept all of the potential consequences. And we don't think about that. Like, I'm putting our,
To make peace with something like that and be able to
that's,
hold the boundaries, oh man.
I can't even, I'm like,
What I know.
my stuff starts coming out with my son, and I'm like, codependency. I'm going to save him if anything were to happen, rescue. Oh
You
gosh.
see, I go into shame about that. I
And I
truly,
go into that too.
yeah, I feel totally ashamed of putting anyone through that. And I know it wasn't a choice of mine, but nevertheless, shame is a human emotion. And when you think of that, is like, yeah, I know why I feel ashamed, because I'm a human being and I just wouldn't want anyone to suffer through my actions like that.
Exactly. The impact we have on others, and we're so selfish in our world that we don't even
Because
think
it's that belief, isn't it? If I don't care about me, how do I believe that you do or anyone does? It's
exactly.
really complex. Yeah, really complex.
Oh man. So I want to finish off with two questions. Um, I think, well, one, I think you've really opened up a conversation for more conversations around how do we create connection. And I think I've even like been really thinking, like, do we ask people, can you tell me about a time where you were really connected to a group? What was that experience like? I don't know. And I'm even sitting here thinking about how have I created genuine connections where I felt
Mhm.
open and comfortable. So that I definitely think there's something around that. But I also think there's something around sustainability and compassion. Those are two,
Yeah.
In this work, yes, we need sustainability, but I really think that compassion is needed as well. And so, how do we create spaces to value both rather than one versus the other?
And can I start with like a political pitch as well on the
Okay.
that's I know, but it's linked to so in England around the treatment services, we have the 10-year strategy, and in there is really clear guidance around the support that the teams need, and we need to be on that. We need to be on that, and not we're not talking about things like supervision and support to make sure that we're hitting the KPIs and all that. We're talking about proper relational support because compassion do you know, that I'm never kind of shy of that, in the sector. I think because the treatment sector is never short of ideas. And I think that's an offshoot of the compassion of people wanting to do more, to help, so ideas to do stuff different. So there's this compassion in the sector. And I think from a therapeutic point of view, my challenge would be, how do you get people that are that compassion to start modeling that therapeutically? So it helps people to develop rather than it being an energy that keeps a service afloat. Because
Mm.
what, from a traditional kind of therapeutic sense, is the way that we would kind of work with people, and I've done this in private psychotherapy, working with people, is if you do kind of lack emotional regulation or affect regulation or that sense of self, the what happens between the two people in the therapy is key. And I think that's where when you hold that compassion and start to share that in a graded way, in a supportive way, to help people to develop compassion for themselves, that's crucial, really crucial. So we need that kind of the space to be able to do that. But I think at the minute the compassion is just about keeping the services going as well, like
Mm.
really passionate and compassionate people. So really good support and structure around that to be able to help people kind of be more effective in that relationship with people. Because that modeling of behavior, I think, then becomes the conduit for people to. And the example I've always used, have we got time, Calliese?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So when I did the trauma training, and prior to that, I used to do some training. I was fortunate. I was asked to go around Europe and do some presentations, which blew my mind. It's like God, street urchin to now sitting in front of a university in Poland talking about
We can
attachment.
do big things,
We can,
see?
yeah, but I know I would love to have been there, Khalees. With like, yes, we can do big things instead of like, what am I doing here? They
Yeah.
find out I'm a fraud. Um,
Mm.
but this kind of this idea of attachment and connection and how we kind of build that. That was what the presentation was all about. And I think within services, having that space to be able to do that with people. So when you're working with someone, the kind of mirroring of is really crucial. And the example I always used in that presentation was I sat in front of psychiatrists, I sat in front of lots of mental health workers, I sat in front of key workers, recovery workers, Public Health England panels to beg my case for funding, and I did all of that in the day. And I did an unplanned detox in a hospital one night, and there was a nurse in the ward, and she came over to me, and she just said, do you want a cup of tea?" Now, previously on that ward, and this is not some amazing people out there, doctors. This is not all doctors are, but unfortunately, the doctor on that ward had said to me that day, "These beds are for people that are really ill," because he didn't believe addiction was. He thought it was a choice I'd
Wow.
made. Um, and with this, like we've said, stresses and pressures that everyone's under, opinions, passively, so very passive aggressive, really kind of. But this nurse had said to me, "Do you want a cup of tea?" And I was, "Yeah, that'd be nice." So I've got kind of drips in me, and it was bonfire night. And she said to me, she said, "You won't be able to see the fireworks from there because I'm on one of the top floors in the hospital." So it was bonfire night. There'd be fireworks in the sky. So she arranged to get those stands for my drips, so she could get me across to the window, and we could look at the fireworks while I had a cup of tea.
Oh, bless.
And she just said to me, she said, "I've seen you in here before." And I said, "Yeah, I've been a few times." And she's like, and she just started talking to me about fireworks and stuff like that. And she wasn't telling me I shouldn't be there. She wasn't telling me I need to stop doing it. She wasn't telling me. What she was doing was through that compassion, she gave a damn about me. And in that moment, and this might just be the kind of romantic spin on the story that I like to believe, but with that and a few other events, it just lit this fire of me caring about me as well. Because prior
Mm.
to that, when I was in hospital, When the doctor said, if you keep doing this, you've only got a few weeks left. And my whole bodily response was like, oh, that long. I can't keep doing this. When I left the hospital that time, it was like, I don't want to keep doing this. Kind of do something different?
Mm,
And that's those moments of like those connected modeling moments of you gave a damn about me. And it's almost like you offered that to me. And a bit like kind of been out in the desert for ages. I just took a little bit of that water and went, could I? Could I do that? You know, and I've been fortunate that a lot of people have just done that along the way enough to I think using your word at the beginning to just inspire a bit of curiosity about my
yeah.
place in this world. And I think we if we can do that, compassion we're not short of, but if we can get that compassion into those relationships to model that so people care more about themselves, there's your work on it. I know people talk about, connection is the opposite to addiction, but how? How do we do that? That's how. We're appealing to
Mm.
this kind of internal intrapsychic process about how we can do that.
I see. I think what you just highlighted too, something I always say is, you know, care, care more about the people.
Mm.
These are people that have families and husbands, wives, children, and love them anyways.
Yeah,
Love them anyways. Love them through the good times and the bad, the ups and the downs. And you know what? I always tell myself is whenever I come at it with an angle of love versus fear versus control, recovery will always win. You can't go wrong if you're doing what's right with love and compassion.
yeah,
And
absolutely. And the healing process behind that is, yeah, it's phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal.
but
And it's
yeah,
and the thing for me is like I could speak to you, and I'm sure you could do the same with me for hours about the importance of that on the recovery journey. But what we're actually talking about now is human condition. We're not talking about addiction. We're talking about just being, like
human.
the humanistic side. And I like that because that moves the conversation away from
I
this
say
ain't
that all
about
the
substances.
time.
It
I
really is
say that
not
all
about
the time.
substances.
I say that all the time. That's literally it. It's like it doesn't matter, y'all, whether you work in the field, whether you don't work in the field. We're talking about human experiences, we're talking about communication skills, we're talking about self-regulation. We all need these
Yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah.
They're foundational, they're universal principles in they're universal to all of us. Get,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
we all get up and we all go to the bathroom. We all drink our coffee or tea or juice or, like we all get frustrated sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that humanist. And I'm not, for anyone listening as well, I'm not kind of assuming that this is like a very linear pathway. And I totally do agree. There are lots of complexities in people's lives, both biologically, psychologically, and I suppose socially as well. So I'm not kind of assuming that, if you're struggling right now or, really sadly, people have took the risk and shared very personal kind of aspects of their lives, and where you think, yep, for all the work that we could talk about now, particularly around development and modeling and that internal process, the external stuff needs to be sorted. So I'm not, again, I'm trying not to skip off into the sunset, but I do think there's a bit of an absence there on that psychological side of we
Yeah.
know so much about development, about brain development, about whether it's developmental kind of ages as we grow up, right up through our kind of teens and older lives. And then when something really traumatic hits us, it can shake our foundations as a person. What I believed, and there's not probably a person, you don't need to be in addiction for this, really sadly, kind of, my mum passed away last year.
Mm,
Shook the world. It's like, oh,
wow. I couldn't imagine not having my mom in my life.
yeah. And it's like, because, and that's the thing is like, everything that kind of was now wasn't in relation to my mum, and all that stuff happened. So for anyone listening, again, it's not just about kind of like, oh, it's trauma and then it's addiction. It's like, well, you know I love the book Seven Deadly Sins, because in there the person writing about addiction says they start off with the phrase everybody be doing something,
Yeah.
and it's like, yeah,
Coffee, tea,
coffee, tea,
whatever,
cigarettes,
anything.
food, gym, exercise, work.
Yeah.
Do you know the difference is? I was talking to someone once who was just absolutely headed for a heart attack. The GP was warning them about their health because of the amount they worked and the stress and pressure they put on themselves. And we had a very shadowy chuckle to each other because I said, we're probably, talking about some very similar processes when we were sharing about who we were and how we met the world. I said, but your adaptation was to work hard and prove everyone wrong. My adaptation was a relationship with substances that dissociated me to the point of like, well, I don't care what anyone thinks anymore.
Hmm.
So you were going to prove them wrong. I weren't going to care. Either way, we're on our journeys to meet this deficit that both of us experienced.
Yeah,
You were getting celebrated for your hard work, and I was a bane on society. Yet we
that's
still had
it.
the same organic problem.
That's it. It's like workaholism, stress, all of those things.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
I want to ask you this question before I finish with my last question because it got put in the chat. Is compassion contagious?
Ooh, what a question that is. What a question. Contagious. But the first, I'll be honest with you, the first word that springs to mind is infectious.
Why?
Because a bit like, and this is might be just to me, it reminded me about kind of when someone did a conversation once about the importance of humor in therapy, and he talked about infectious laughter. He
I
was saying,
like that.
you walk into a room and people are laughing, you'll start laughing and you don't know why. It's like, what?
What are we laughing at?
What are we laughing at? What are we laughing at? And it's like, if you create, you were saying earlier about cultures, and it's like within services or within like mutual aid groups or families, or, if you create that culture, it's like people join in you know
Mhm.
and I think if so, for instance, if we took that line of like, I'm manager of a service and I want my service to be compassionate, which means we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're always going to do this, and we're going to do it for each other, not just the people walking through the door. We're going to do it for each other. We'll create this culture of compassion, and I think people can join in with that. I do. I think the risk is with that question, and I do think it's a phenomenally good question, which I probably need to shut up
I
about.
know we need to like explore it.
But
Like,
yeah, but the risk but actually, if you haven't got a lot to give because of stuff that's happening in your own life, it can be really difficult as well. And I
mm,
think what happens is, and we see this a lot within treatment services, is people are very compassionate. They come in, but one day they go back to the well and the well is dry because they're giving out a lot of what they're not getting in. If you work in if you work in a service where you're helping people all day long, and at the end of the day, all your dashboard is telling you you've not done this, you've not done that, you haven't hit this target, you've not hit
ah,
this. It's like,
that's
ooh,
right.
we've got a rupture occurring there. So yeah, I would say compassion is definitely infectious, contagious. Is that the same? Is that
I don't know. Like now, I wrote in my book, confession,
yeah.
contagious versus infectious. Like
If the person who's
I need
commented wants to say if they think, is it the
clarity.
same?
What's
Have
the
I just
difference
yeah.
between contagious and infectious? I guess like whenever I think about infectious without Googling, it's like an infection, like a disease,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe infection.
Yeah, yeah. But then across the kind of work that's done, we talk about, I mean, we're fortunate enough, like you and I were at the recovery walk this weekend.
Yeah.
Get onto the social media platforms, you'll see the photos. What an experience. And it was infectious. I was walking down the street. There were people shopping in the town that were like smiling, going, "Hey man, what's all this about?" It's like they weren't even on the walk. And they were like, "Well, this is
Let's
great."
go.
The drums were banging, and it was like, oh, it's about recovery. It's about people that kind of had problems with addiction now doing something different. A load of people here with lived experience. You've got services with the banners up. You've got this, that, and the other. They're going, oh man, this is brilliant. It's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I just think, is that infectious? Is that contagious recovery? Yeah, I think it
Somebody
is.
put in
That's
the
how you
chat,
reach kids.
infection and contagious are the same thing,
There
synonyms.
we go. That'll do. That'll do.
Interesting.
But but I
And
do
some
think, there is always that principle of yes, it is. But how do we nurture that and how do we look after that? Because I don't think it's a given. I don't think it's a case of, if I'm laughing, will you laugh? It's like, if I haven't got a lot to give, it's hard to be compassionate, so
yeah.
we need to look after ourselves as well.
And somebody else also put in the chat, like we have a culture of risk management and mitigation versus a culture of hope and human potential, which I really align with that.
And
With
that's
it.
that's the rub. That is the rub. And I think, and I've been fortunate enough to meet, I mean, recently I've done some supervision training with an organization called Cranston, and their team came in and they were talking about very honest groups of people. And they were talking about very knowledgeable, that risk of, and they're just so passionate about what they do with lots of compassion. And they recognize that they've got this kind of system, this seven eye looking down at them, telling them what to do, and they've got to work in there, and they figure it out. They figure out how to
Mm.
do that. They kind of keep
The
evolving.
loopholes.
Yeah, and it is. And again, for anyone watching who's sitting kind of, who processes NDTMS data, and that's not a criticism because I also know why we need to collect that data. We need to understand that treatment is effective. We need to know, like, approximately, I think at the minute, was it 330,000 people are on the NDTMS system as being in treatment in England. We need to know how they're getting on.
Wow.
Is treatment effective for them? Is it working? What feedback are we getting? So yeah, I'm not one for just kind of like, let's just have a go and see how it works out. No, we need to understand what we're doing, why, and make sure it's safe for people too, because it's a big system, with nearly £1 billion invested in it every year. It's a big system.
Yeah, definitely. So, my last question for those listening today, whether they're practitioners, leaders, family members, community members, what are the top 2 to 3 takeaways or pieces of advice you'd leave them with that they can start applying?
So I think the first one that always kind of registers for me, and we've talked about it today, is that I think is it Gestalt talks about kind of point zero, that non kind of assumptive position. If you're ever supporting anyone, it's impossible. We're human beings. We've got our experiences. We know what we know, and we'll have experienced stuff before. But it always reminds me of what Michael Clemens said, who was a doctor in America who had his own addiction problems, and got into recovery, and then he wanted to go and fix the world. He wanted to get everyone else into recovery, and he said it didn't dawn on me until one day he was in an office with a guy who walked in, and he swore at him and told him that he was an effing addict. And usually, he said, as a doctor, I went in to fix people. So I go, right, this is what we're going to do about you not being an addict anymore. And he said, it hit me.
How'd that work out? Yeah.
What does it mean to be an addict to you?
Mm,
That was his first question. So anyone listening to this is that kind of point zero. Let's start where you're at. Now, the second takeaway for me, for anyone kind of listening to this today or listening in the future, is that is a fantastic thing to do if you can walk alongside someone and say, right, we're going to make sense and meaning of this, but we're going to make your sense and meaning of it. Not what I think addiction is, not what I think you should do next, or what you're going to tell me what's figural for you. You're going to tell me what makes sense to you. We'll walk that journey together. Even in the systems, try and do that wherever you can. Even if you're a housing officer, don't assume the biggest problem is housing, because for some people, on paper, it might be, but it might not be. Be curious, not critical. That's the phrase I always use. It's the hashtag I plaster on everything. Curious, not critical. The second part to that, the second takeaway today is look after you.
mm,
It is a big ask. If you're kind of working with people, supporting with people, working within systems, working as part of teams where there is a lot of stress or pressure, where there's potential for vicarious secondary kind of trauma, compassion fatigue, whatever phrase we want to use, look after you. Because in my experience, or my hope, or even my desire, the best thing that we can do is be available at the contact boundary for people when they say, I need help.
mm,
But not be available as a key worker, not be available as a therapist, not be available as a recovery lived experience expert, be available as you. The methodologies will change. In 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, MI training, CBT, they will change. The bit that we know always works relationally is the connection between be you. Be in that moment. If you've got curiosities, if you don't understand, don't try and be an expert. Don't try, be who you are, bring what you can, and know why you are doing that. That develop that awareness of self. That alone will encourage people to do that for themselves, as that nurse did for me. Be curious about yourself, Andy. Why don't you think about yourself like this? Verbally and non-verbally, we carry so many messages that we probably don't even understand.
mhm,
So do that. That equation is critical. And if you work in a particular sector where you are deemed to be an expert or deemed to be the recovery worker that needs to help people, don't be frightened to ask for help. I've seen too many people that have just struggled because they've wanted to not to be seen to be struggling. We all do. We're all human. It's difficult work. We can hear some very difficult things. It's difficult for the people that walk into the services. If you're compassionate and you're empathic, that door is wide open for compassion fatigue, for vicarious look after you. They would be my kind of two relational standpoints, really. Yeah, and if you know stuff, share it.
yeah.
I've always benefited from amazing people that are so knowledgeable on the subject, and I've sat down with people and I said, "How come you've never done a webinar before? This is amazing what you talk about." Get out there, talk about it, share it. Yeah,
Definitely. I like that. You like highlighted a lot of the things that I talk about too, like curiosity and compassion and ask people to just have conversations. You know, if we just ask questions, people tell us what they want, people tell us who they are, people tell us what they like and don't like and
yeah,
enjoy. But are we willing? That's a good one. Are we willing to get curious?
yeah, yeah,
Are
yeah.
we
There's
willing
nothing
to
more
admit that we
powerful
don't
than
know all the answers?
there you go. There's nothing more powerful than being seen and being validated, not being fixed, just being seen and being validated. You
Yeah,
know, far too many people in addiction live under any kind of emotional, relational, social radar. Be seen
yeah.
when you see someone and validate them and validate their existence. Watch what happens.
Yeah.
It's
And I
amazing.
love that, and I love too that you said like if you don't know, you don't know, that's okay. I'm telling you, I say I don't know all the time. But you know what? I've also realized as myself, I will have more respect for somebody who says they don't know or they don't have all the answers than somebody who pretends that they do.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
would rather actually choose that person because I'm like, you know what?
yeah,
At least they have some humility and like they're like,
yeah, yeah.
I don't know. And I'm like, I like that.
Oh, I
I
love
like
it. I love it because the whole kind of sector, whether it be like say mutual aid or treatment, there's a lot of polarizing. Do you know or don't you know? Are you good? Are you bad? Get in that grey area.
oh
Get in that
what?
grey area. It's wonderful in there. You know, take the pressure off.
Take a swim. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Angie. This was a great conversation. I feel like I have some rabbit holes to go down, and I'm sure everybody else does as well.
Oh,
If,
I'll be there later. I'll be there later. Go and
yeah,
look at
definitely. If
that.
anybody
Look
has
at it.
wants to leave
Yeah.
any comments, I'll tell Angie to go check them out and respond. And yeah, thank you so much.
It's been an absolute. Thank you for asking me as well. And like I say, we were privileged to go and be part of the recovery walk this
Yeah.
weekend. There's lots of videos and photos out there, and next year's will be in Bradford. So, you know, get yourself there. It's what an experience. Just what an experience to be around and celebrate such amazing things with so many people. So yeah, lots of old friends there this weekend, and made lots of new ones too, which is
Oh,
fantastic.
beautiful.
All right.
Bye, y'all. Perfect. Let's see.